Thank you, Cole, for presenting and starting us off for our spring lineup. You have 50 minutes. Take it away.
Very good. So thank you everybody for coming. And so today I'm going to be presenting a joint project with Martin Jansen, where we look at consumer search and product returns. All right. So the motivation for this project is that the recent rise in e-commerce has come with a sharp increase in products being returned after they're being purchased. To give a size of how big this behavior, this phenomena is, the National Retail Federation compiled data from retailers in the United States and estimated that about $428 billion worth of merchandise was returned in the year 2020, which comprises around 10% of the total retail sales for that year. And if we look at online retail, these numbers are approximately 102 billion and about 18% of online sales. So it's a significant number of goods that are purchased and then returned. Now, from an economics perspective, this could give rise to some inefficiency concerns. So for one, you have the potential for unnecessary, in quotation marks, shipping costs, because the goods, they're often shipped to the consumers, then they have to be shipped back without providing value added to the good itself. And then there's also the potential for unnecessary costs in depreciation of the value of the good for the firm, because when products are returned, they have to be processed, and it might be more difficult to the firm to actually resell them. And so as you browse both the management literature and then also just informal writings by people in the field, there are urges from people for managers to treat product returns strategically. So not just to think of product returns as being a necessary evil to deal with, but to think of it as just a part of the business itself. And so that's how we're going to think of it as well. So one thing is, if we see this significant number of goods being returned, it's clear that consumers are not fully aware of their match value with goods at the time that they're initially purchasing them. So that brings us to the other potential hidden side of product returns. So consumers, they might have the ability to learn more easily after they purchase a good about whether or not they like the good. So for us, it might be that there's a lower inspection cost for the good after they purchase it than beforehand. And this is certainly true in online markets, where it's easier for a consumer to inspect the good once they receive it and they have it in their hands, rather than combing through all of the reviews and all of the information online about the product. This, of course, will vary depending on the product. The difference in the ease of learning, how much they like it, might be large or small. But allowing consumers to return products might allow them to improve their match value with the product, because they can purchase it, more easily inspect it, and then if they like the good, keep it, and otherwise return it. Okay, so we are hinting at now these costs and benefits that could be associated with product returns. And so this motivates the following questions that we have. So do product returns efficiently trade off the social costs due to waste and the social benefits of more efficient search? What are some features of typical product markets where you might expect products to be returned? And also, would firms actually choose to stimulate product returns? And if so, are the return policies they choose socially optimal? And finally, who benefits from offering product returns, consumers or the firms? Okay. So here's how we're going to approach these questions. Here's what we do. We're going to introduce product returns into the search framework of Volinsky and Anderson-Renault. So in this framework, everybody here, I'm sure, knows the framework, but just to remind you, so in our application of this model, we're going to have a mass of consumers and a mass of firms. Now, each consumer has demand for one unit of a good, but does not know his match value with each of the firms, but does know that the match values are independent across the firms. So here's the novelty. Here's what we introduce. So for firms, their strategy space is now going to be two-dimensional. So firms, they set their price and also the refund, where the refund is the amount of money that's given back to the consumer if they purchase the item and then return it. And then to capture the costs that I was mentioning earlier associated with returns, firms are also going to have a salvage value for returned products. So for a lower salvage value, this captures the idea that there are higher social costs to these returns. Now, the other change we make is on the consumer side, and more importantly, the consumer side here. So for consumers, after they visit a firm, what they're going to do is they're going to visit the firm, see the price they charge and the refund that they offer, and choose whether or not they're going to inspect the product first before purchasing the good, or they can purchase the good and then inspect it afterwards when the inspection cost is lower. All right. So those are the main features that we are going to be adding to this model. And here's what we find. So just to broadly sketch the results, we have 3 sets of results. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at what we call a symmetric refund equilibrium. So this is an equilibrium where the firms are going to offer the same price and refund, and consumers are going to be willing to forego inspecting the good until after they purchased it. And so that there's going to be a positive probability that they return the item. So what we find is that in a symmetric refund equilibrium, firms are going to choose their price and refund so that consumers are made perfectly indifferent between inspecting the product before and after purchasing it. All right, and so then we're also going to then characterize features of the equilibrium. So one, the equilibrium, the refund equilibrium is, the equilibrium refund is going to exceed the firm's salvage value. So for each item that's brought back, the firm is going to give more in the refund than they will get in value in return. And then we'll explore some comparative statics, which will give us a feel for how this equilibrium works. So just one particular comparative static that I found interesting was that lowering the post-purchase inspection cost can actually reduce consumer surplus, has the potential. So what this means is that as we make it easier for consumers to inspect the good after they purchase it, it actually is going to benefit firms, but harm consumers, which is a counterintuitive result. All right, second, we're going to come through the parameter space, and we're going to characterize which equilibria exist in which region. Okay, and so what we find is that equilibria with positive sales are unique. So for each parameter, range of parameter, or particular parameter vector, there's going to be a unique equilibrium with positive sales. So the refund equilibrium, what we find is that it exists when the salvage value is high and the post-purchase inspection cost is low. So what this means is that in a broad sense, the market does well when deciding when to offer refunds. So when the salvage value is high, that means that the social cost to returns is lower. And when the post-purchase inspection cost is low, that means the benefit is also higher from having returns. So this is a positive feature of the market. Now, if we look at other parameters, as we raise the post-purchase inspection cost or lower the relative salvage value to the production cost, what we find is that the equilibria are either going to be ones where all of the firms offer contracts so that none of the consumers will return the item, or it could be that, or it's going to be that some offer contracts so that consumers will inspect after, and the others offer contracts so that consumers inspect before. All right. And then finally, we look at the issue of welfare. And so for this section, what we do is we look at the position of a social planner who can choose the contracts offered by the firm. So the social planner can choose the price and the refund to maximize total welfare. What we find is that the refund equilibria are generically inefficient, generating either too few or too many returns. And then finally, we probably won't have time to go into this, but we also look at the case where the social planner can choose the percentage of the price that firms can offer as a refund, but firms are allowed to choose their own prices, which is probably more realistic. And what we find is that in this case, a small increase in the refund above the market equilibrium value can actually harm consumers. So this gives us a word of caution that if you're going to actually implement some policies, you need to do it correctly because it could have a deleterious effect on consumers. Okay, so this is a broad overview of the results. So in terms of the literature, the closest paper to ours is a working paper by Matthews and Persico, where they study a monopoly. In their framework, consumers learn their match value at an inspection cost before purchase, but without a cost after purchase. So they can still choose whether or not they inspect. So their paper focuses on resolving what they call the excess refund puzzle, trying to explain why the refund exceeds the salvage value. And they get that same result that I mentioned earlier that we get. Now, they don't look at the market context like we do, and they also don't study the trade-off between reducing consumers' inspection and search costs and the inefficiency of product returns. And they do not get at the welfare results, indicating that there may be too little in terms of returns. Right. In a more recent paper, and one that was presented in this seminar series about a year ago, Girath and Wren, they add the possibility that search can be uninformative and that firms may choose the complexity of the return policies, where the complexity in the framework captures the probability that if you purchase an item, you will violate some rule so you can't return it. Now, they show how different outcomes of their model account for different refund practices. And there's a broader literature in this vein that I'll bypass for now. Now, also in the realm of search, Petrikite introduces product returns in a model where consumers learn one component of a match value before purchase and another after purchase. Now, in that framework, inspection is not optional, and refunds have to be full, and the salvage value is equal to the production cost. For us, we're going to vary the salvage value. And this paper focuses on something different than we do. They do not address whether firms stimulate product returns and how this affects market efficiency by economizing on the search cost and creating waste. So we have a different focus in our paper. And our work also contributes to this newer strand of literature that characterizes how consumers search when they have the option of not inspecting beforehand, when that's an optional decision for them. They don't have to search before purchasing. This is done by Duvall, and without prices being set, and then by Chen et al. Allowing prices to be observable. In this framework, they do not consider the product returns or how firms strategically influence them. All right, so I feel like I'm blasting through this talk so far. So any questions before I present the model? All right, so to the model. All right, so the environment. We have a unit mass of risk neutral firms, a unit mass of consumers, each with unit demand, and match values are going to be distributed IID according to a distribution that the distribution and 1 minus the distribution itself are both log concave. So at the start of the game, firms are going to set the price and the refund. Now, the refund is the amount of money that's given back to the consumers if they decide to return the good. Now, in practice, you could have return policies where the refund is full, but then you charge a return fee. So this could also include that, where you have the refund being the full price minus the return fee. Or you could give the shipping costs to the consumer, have them pay their shipping costs. So there are many interpretations for the refund. It doesn't have to be precisely just the amount of money given back. Firms have a constant marginal production cost C and a salvage value, which is less than that for returned items. Now, the difference between C and ADA that it could include, one interpretation is it includes the cost to repair a returned item or the shipping cost. Right, consumers are going to engage in sequential search. So they begin by incurring a cost epsilon to visit a firm and learn the price and the refund that they offer. And at this point, they have 4 options. They can either inspect the good before purchasing it at a cost S, learn the match value, and then decide whether they're going to buy it. So this is the typical way it's modeled in search. Or they can decide to first buy the product and then inspect it at a lower cost, beta times S, and then decide whether to keep the good or return it for a refund. They can also decide not to inspect the good at all. So they could buy the good and not apply any effort into inspecting it to decide whether it's worth keeping or returning. Or if the price and refund are not tolerable to them, they could just leave and proceed to the next firm. All right, so a few comments on the model. So one way to think about this difference in the inspection costs is Then you can have brick and mortar and online options. So you can have a consumer, they could go to the brick and mortar store with an inspection cost of S, or they can purchase it online and then inspect it at home at a cost of beta times S. So you can think of the decision being discrete in that sense. Or you could also think of the consumer inspecting online at cost S. So they could just scroll through the internet, having to acquire details of the product at cost S, or then they could just decide not to do so and then just buy it and then inspect it at home at the cost beta S. And as I mentioned before, the transportation costs are one reason why the ADA would be less, the salvage value would be less than the production cost. And the difference between the price and the refund could include a measure of how the costs are divided between the firms and the consumers. One could also reinterpret the variables and introduce a hassle cost for consumers. So if consumers, for example, have no cost to inspect the good afterwards, but have to incur a cost of some amount to take the good and do the return.
Can I ask a clarifying question on the model? So
Sure.
if you go back a slide, so if they inspect and take the return option, assuming they don't like it enough, they terminate search or they continue search?
They can continue search.
Okay, so it behaves just like kind of I had been imagining before then. So
Exactly,
the only way it ends is with a final selection, not just a purchase, but a purchase and not return.
Exactly.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Great. Any more questions before we dive into the analysis?
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
On this paper. So I'm not sure that this is necessary, but could you motivate more on the assumption that the consumer only inspect the one product at home, but not purchasing a lot and only keeping one?
Right. So you're asking why not do purchase
why
a number of items?
Yes, because I suppose if the consumers just sitting in front of the computer and just receiving boxes, and then why don't they do a simultaneous search but a sequential one?
Let's see. Given our setup right now, if we gave the consumer that ability, I don't think that would ever be optimal right now. If you have the ability to buy a number of goods and then inspect them all, there's no additional benefit. So you could always perform better by just buying one, inspecting it, and then deciding to return it. Now you might say that maybe inspection is even cheaper if you buy a whole bunch of goods and then inspect them collectively, right? So you might be able to make an argument like that, but we don't have that in the model. But yeah, as the model stands, we could give them that ability and they wouldn't take it. Great.
One more, just while we're asking. So the idea is that both the return policy and the price are learned after paying that initial search cost.
Yes.
Is that as realistic? Like, I understand why we think of hidden prices as reasonable, but aren't return policies generally kind of set? And most of the stores we go to, we know their policies before getting there.
I think that's true for some, but there are going to be some smaller firms, of course, where you don't know precisely what the policy is. But I think you'd be surprised actually how much we don't know, because for myself, I comb through several different firms. So I looked at some clothing. So for example, Nordstrom, Saks Fifth Avenue, and I found return policies I wasn't aware of. Okay, so like you had to return the item within 14 days. The different restocking fee. And I think if I were to quiz some people right now on the fees for Amazon, I'm not sure they would know off the top of their head, actually. I think many people would assume that it's free to just return the item, but that's not true. If you look, it depends on the item. So there's going to be some items that there is a return fee and some that it's not. So I would say that it's actually, at least for myself, if I'm taking myself as a data point, I don't actually know all of the return policies that Amazon has for the different types of goods. And I think in the fine print, I think that's where a lot of the work is. Yeah. Any other questions? Great. All right. Let's begin the analysis. So just to first give us a feel for how the search behavior proceeds for the consumers. Suppose a consumer has already incurred the epsilon search cost to visit a firm and has an outside option of A. So here, A is an equilibrium object. We're thinking of this as the continuation value of continuing the search at the remaining firms. So from the consumer's perspective, there are going to be 4 inspection options, as we mentioned before. They can buy and never inspect the good. So their expected utility then is just the expected value of the good minus the price. They can buy and inspect the product afterwards. So then for them, the expected utility is going to be the max of either their match value or the refund plus the continuation value. They'll always pay the price and the inspection costs afterwards. They could inspect the product and then decide whether or not to buy it. So the typical approach, or they could just leave and take A. Now to characterize for which prices and refunds the different inspection choices we made, we have the following graphs. So for a very low price and also low refund, for the consumer, it'll be beneficial just to never inspect the good. You can just buy it. If it were free, for example, you just buy the good for free. If you inspect, if the price is higher, but the refund is not sufficiently generous, then you would want to inspect the good beforehand. Now, if you make the price too high, then you will just, of course, leave the firm. Now, for a moderate price and for a generous enough refund, the consumer will choose to then inspect the good afterwards, decide whether they want to keep it or not, and then leave. Right?
Can I ask, just the key here is that they don't learn anything until they inspect in terms of the value, right? So They treat everything the same except in its policy and price. And that's driving this, right? Versus like you could think even for a low price, there's always a bad enough match value when we think about search at all stages, like kind of the classic version of this model. But the key here is that until you inspect, there is no difference among products except in the price and the refund.
Exactly. So here we're looking at the decision that's being made before you've inspected anything, right? So you're taking the expectations over your match value. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so that characterizes the search behavior of the consumers. Now for the firms, we could also compute their profit. So I'm not going to be using the particular expressions for the profit in this talk, but I'll just leave them here as a point of reference if somebody has a question. But let me push on in the interest of time. Okay, so let's start off by characterizing a symmetric refund equilibrium. So a symmetric refund equilibrium is going to be a perfect Bayesian equilibrium with passive beliefs, which could be characterized by a triple, a price, a refund, and the outside option, the continuation value, where we require that the price and the refund is the best reply among all the contracts given the outside option. Given this contract, consumers prefer to inspect after purchase, right? So UA is the utility from inspecting after purchase as opposed to before, never inspecting or just leaving. And the outside option solves this equation. So the continuation value is to proceed to the next firm and also inspect after purchase and incurring the epsilon search cost to learn the price and refund. Okay, so here's our first result. So we say that what we find is that if a symmetric refund equilibrium exists, then it is unique and has the following properties. So the price and the refund are going to be set so that the consumers are indifferent between inspecting products before and after purchasing them. And they're going to strictly prefer these two options to the other two options. And the refund is going to strictly exceed the salvage value. So to give an idea for why we have the first result, so why are the consumers being made indifferent between inspecting before and after? In an equilibrium, in a refund equilibrium, we know that the contract must lie in this region, right? So the region where consumers are willing to inspect after. Now, if we're in the interior, if the contract is in the interior of this region, firms will be able to increase the price. Consumers will still purchase the good, right? So it's still optimal for them to inspect after, and it'll just increase the profit for the given firm. Okay, so there's always going to be a profitable deviation. And so we know that the contracts must lie on one of the boundaries. Now, one can see that if the contract lies on the boundary where consumers are indifferent between inspecting after and leaving, then that'll produce the traditional diamond paradox. Okay, and so that cannot serve as an equilibrium. So we know that if a symmetric refund equilibrium exists, it must lie on this curve, particularly on the interior of this curve. Right. Later on, we'll, of course, characterize when different equilibria exist. But right now we're saying if it exists, we know it must lie on this curve. Right. And we can also give an economic argument for why the refund exceeds the salvage value. And I'll return to this if somebody is curious. But in the interest of time, I'll push on with the comparative statics. So first, our first comparative static we're going to look at it, we're going to vary the production cost and the salvage value, as these capture the costs to society from returns. So what we find is that in a symmetric refund equilibrium, the price and the refund are going to be unaffected by the production cost. So that if we increase the production cost, profit is going to decline, the consumers are going to gain the same surplus, and the total welfare is going to be smaller. And the reason why the price and refund are not affected by the production cost is because when setting the, you can just look at the profit function for the firm. When you look at the profit function, they will pay the production costs regardless of whether or not a return is made. So for them, it is a fixed cost, essentially. Right? But more interesting, if we raise the salvage value, it's going to lead to higher profit, less consumer surplus, and larger total welfare. Okay, so this result isn't obvious, I wouldn't say, but the intuition is the following: that when you compute the price and refund that are offered in equilibrium, they're both going to be increasing in the salvage value, but their difference is going to remain constant. So you actually find that in equilibrium, the difference between the price and the refund are independent of the salvage value. But the specific values for them are both increasing. So the consumers are going to be harmed because they always pay the price every time they purchase the item, but they only receive the refund in the instances that they don't like the product. Right? So if you have these two values that are going up at the same rate, though they always have to pay the price, only sometimes receive the refund. So they are actually harmed by increasing the salvage value. Okay, so that gets at the parameters that affect the social costs for returns for the economy. Let's looking at the social benefit. So remember, beta is governing the cost to inspecting after purchasing the good. So as we lower beta, so we make it easier to inspect after purchase, what we find is that naturally there's going to be higher total welfare because society is going to gain from easier search. But a less generous refund is necessary to stimulate returns, right? So we're going to find that the difference between the price and the refund is larger while the refund itself is smaller, okay? And there's going to be higher consumer surplus if and only if the price itself also declines. Okay, so there can be we can find examples where the price goes down and also examples where the price goes up. So the idea is that although the difference between the price and the refund grows, because the refund is declining, it's not pinned down whether the price is going up or down. So, but we can look at an example where it's clear what happens. So let's look at the case where match values are uniformly distributed between 0 and 1. What we're going to find is that consumer surplus is going to decrease and profit increases as the inspection after purchase is made easier. Okay, so we're talking about lowering beta here. And so for consumers, as we lower beta, their consumer surplus is going to decline while profit is going to grow. Okay, great. Now, for our final comparative static-like result, we say, okay, consider the case where the post-purchase inspection cost is 0. So here we're just going to set beta equal to 0, set the salvage value to 0, and assume that the lower bound for the match value is also 0. Now let's look at the case where we take the inspection cost to be arbitrarily large. Okay, so here we're still looking at a refund equilibrium. So this is an equilibrium where consumers never pay the inspection cost, right? Because beta is 0 and S is only paid beforehand. What we find is that as we take S to be large, the consumer surplus is going to vanish the refund itself is going to vanish, and firms are going to capture the ex-ante surplus. So this is an interesting result because what it's saying is that even though there's this cost that is never paid by the consumers, as we raise this cost, it's going to reduce consumer surplus. And what's driving this result is the fact that the firms are making the consumers indifferent between inspecting before and after. And so as we increase this inspection cost beforehand, we make it harder to inspect beforehand, it takes away the strength of this deviation for consumers, right? And so the idea is that consumers strongly benefit from examining the product after buying it. The firms can acquire the entire ex-ante surplus. And so returning to our example with the uniform distribution, if we set beta equals to 0, so now S really just captures the pre-purchase inspection cost. As we increase that, we see that the price is going to increase. Now the refund itself is going to be non-monotonic. It's going to, as a result stated, it'll eventually drop down to 0. The consumer surplus is dropping, and profits itself is non-monotonic actually, because as the search cost, the inspection cost is increasing for an intermediate value, firms benefit from having consumers visiting other firms and then returning to visit themselves. But as you increase this inspection cost, it becomes less desirable for consumers to ever return the item. All right, great. So any questions about this set of results? Okay. All right, so that was analyzing the symmetric refund equilibrium. Now let's characterize the regions for which the equilibrium exists. Okay, so one assumption we're going to make in this section is we're going to assume that the profit for the firm is going to be strictly concave in the refund. So in particular, what we're saying is let P, the price as a function of tau, that's the price that's keeping the consumers indifferent between inspecting before and after. So we're along that curve. We're saying along that curve, the profit function is going to be strictly concave in the refund. And when we look at the uniform distribution, this holds for these parameter values, but proving it more generally has been difficult. But with this assumption, what we're going to do is the following. We're going to say, let's fix the search costs and the salvage value and characterize equilibria as we vary the production cost and the post-purchase inspection parameter. And we're going to focus on parameters in which the markets are active. So we're going to restrict the size of the search costs and the salvage value so that utility is going to be positive from inspecting before purchase when all firms charge what we call the Volinsky price. So this is the optimal price when consumers inspect before. Utility is going to be positive from inspecting after purchase when firms play their part in the candidate refund equilibrium. So there's going to be a unique candidate refund equilibrium, and we restrict the parameter so the utility would be positive in that case. And cutting the price to induce no inspection is not profitable when all firms charge the Volinsky price. Okay. So achieving this restriction is just limiting our parameters to a neighborhood around 0. So it's not necessarily a small neighborhood around it, but it is in that quadrant, as it were. All right. So any questions about what we're doing here? Great. All right. So here's how we're going to do it. We're going to have this plot where we're going to vary beta and we're going to vary C. So looking first at the case where beta equals 1, so there's no benefit to consumers for inspecting after purchase, and where there's no loss for firms, they salvage the entire value of the good. We find is that the Volinsky equilibrium, so that's what we're going to refer to as an equilibrium where all consumers inspect before purchasing. These become the same. This is the same as the refund equilibrium, okay? Because when beta equals 1, so there's no benefit from consumers inspecting after purchase, the firms have to offer a full refund in order to incentivize them to inspect after purchase. And when the firms recoup the entire value of the good, the firm's profit is the same whether the consumer inspects before or after purchase. And so what we find is that there's a refund equilibrium and a Volinsky equilibrium at this point, and they're exactly the same in terms of welfare, profit, and consumer surplus. But now let's move away from this particular point. Okay, so let us keep C equal to eta. So we're going to keep it so that firms still recoup the entire value from the returned items. But let's make it easier now for consumers to inspect after purchase. What we find is that as we lower it, there's a refund equilibrium, and that's the unique equilibrium now. So then in this region, the firms can now offer less than a full refund, and they'll increase their profits while consumers prefer to inspect afterwards. Now, as we increase the production cost, we're going to find that there's a region now where this refund equilibrium exists. So increasing the production cost makes it more desirable for firms to not incentivize returns. So it's going to it's going to reduce the profits, because for each item that's sold in return, the firm has to pay that production cost, right? So they're going to experience lower profits, but actually because of our earlier result, the consumer surplus is going to be constant in this region, because increasing the production cost has no effect on consumer surplus. Now, as we get to this boundary, so the graph of C lower bar, which marks where the equilibrium ceases to exist, the refund equilibrium ceases to exist, what we find is that there's going to be a region where there's an asymmetric equilibrium, and that's the only equilibrium, where there are going to be some firms that offer a contract, a price and return policy, so that consumers are willing to inspect after purchase and possibly return the item. And some will offer a less generous return policy, possibly zero, and consumers will choose to inspect beforehand. And that's going to be the unique equilibrium. Right. And then finally, to complete the characterization, as we continue increasing the production cost, eventually no firms will be willing to allow returns. And so then we'll just have the Volinsky equilibrium. And here, C star is the cost at which, above that cost, the consumer surplus is negative in the Volinsky equilibrium. All right, so we're able to plot and characterize which regions we have these equilibriums. So this is the region that's novel, that's truly novel to our model where we were characterizing previously. Great. So any questions at this point? Cool. All right, so then we can summarize this graph. Oh, Dan, did you have a question?
I was just going to let you know you have 12 minutes.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Okay, so then we can just characterize this graph in a theorem, which I won't go through the details. All right, so let's turn to what I think is the most interesting section, which is that to do with efficiency. So we're going to first look at the case where a social planner sets the firm's prices and refunds, while consumers are allowed to search as they see fit. And our question here is, does the market arrive at an efficient return policy? All right, so I'll just cut to the chase. So our result is that the social optimum is achieved by having all firms offer the same contract. Okay, so here we're allowing the social planner to choose any distribution over contracts, but the way they can achieve the social optimum is by offering the same contract where the price minus the refund is equal to the difference between the production cost and the salvage value. So one way to interpret this is that if the difference between the cost and the salvage value is just the transportation cost, so like the shipping cost of the good, then it is, and that's the only cost for firms, then it's optimal, socially efficient to have consumers pay for it. Okay, and at the social optimum, we can characterize it as the follows. There's a strictly decreasing function. Okay, so if we go back to our plot where we have the production cost on the y-axis and beta on the x-axis, there's going to be a strictly decreasing function, so that if the production cost is low enough, consumers are going to inspect the good after purchasing it. Now, if the production cost exceeds this function, then consumers are going to inspect a good after purchasing it. And along the curve, consumers are indifferent between the two options. So returning to our previous plot, So this is what equilibria exist. But now what we're saying is that there's going to be another function so that below it's efficient to have returns and above it's efficient to have Volinsky. So in a rough sense, we can already see that the market is doing a good job of choosing which market structure to have. Of course, we can plainly see that the asymmetric equilibria is never going to be optimal because the optimum is either going to be Volinsky or the refund equilibrium. But in a rough sense, we see that the market does well. But right, so we want to ask though, is it doing as good as it can though? So this is a corollary of the previous result. We say that at a point in which the market equilibrium is a refund equilibrium and the social optimum involves returns. So we're in the region where both the market itself would offer returns and the social planner would want to do so. So we're below both of those functions. The social planner can improve welfare by reducing the difference between the price and the refund to equal the difference between the production cost and the salvage value. Because recall we said that at the optimum is achieved when these are equal. But what we can argue is that in below both curves, the difference between the price and the refund is going to be strictly larger than the production cost and the salvage value. And I won't go into too much detail. This just comes from, it's very simple, but I want to keep going. Yeah, so then I want to get to this example here. So remember, C lower bar is the plot that tells us where the refund equilibrium exists. So below C lower bar, this is where the refund equilibrium exists. And below F, that's where it's socially optimal to have returns being made. So you can see here that below F, for the uniformly distributed case, society correctly chooses to allow returns, but the social planner can still improve by making the return policy more generous. But interestingly, in the region between F and C lower bar, there are parameters for which the market offers returns, but the social planner would prefer to have Volinsky played. So in that case, there are too many returns being made. So we have both possibilities presented by this example. It could be that there are too few returns being made or too many returns. All right. Okay, and because I have a couple minutes still, great. So I'm gonna now look at the final set of results. So in that last waffle result, that was allowing the social planner to choose both the price and the refund. So that's the perfect ideal. But in reality, the regulators have probably less control over prices, at least in the broad settings that we're looking at, but they might be able to choose how generous a return policy must be. Okay, so the way we're going to think about this is that for the social planner is going to choose a value theta, and for firms, they must offer a contract, so a price and refund, in the region where the refund exceeds theta times the price. Okay. And we're going to refer to a constrained equilibrium as just an equilibrium of the game subject to firms selecting contracts in the permitted region, right? So we're going to look at the interesting case where the unique equilibrium in the market is a refund equilibrium and where the social planner can improve welfare by stimulating more returns. So where the parameters are such that we are below both of those two curves, the C lower bar and the F from earlier. Of course, if we're in the region where the social planner does not want to stimulate returns, they wouldn't choose theta at all. They would not want to choose theta above the equilibrium value for theta. Okay, so we're gonna look at this case where they can improve welfare by choosing a theta larger than the equilibrium value. So here's our first result for this. Consider a refund equilibrium and a regulation imposing a refund threshold that is marginally higher than the equilibrium refund. So let's say that you have your regulator, they want to increase the number of returns, they want to require a more generous return policy, but they only have the ability to increase it by a small amount. Well, then there is a constrained equilibrium generating higher profits, lower consumer surplus that keeps social welfare unchanged, actually. And the reason why is that if we move along this curve, so along the curve where consumers are indifferent between inspecting after and before, consumer surplus is going, consumer surplus is going down. So if we move these contracts here, and the reason why is it's simple, that if you think about it, their utility from inspecting after is the same as inspecting before. Now, if you inspect before, your utility only depends on the price. You don't care what the refund is because you're never going to return the item, right? And so as we're going up, the price is going up, your utility has to be going down, okay? So along the curve where these two are equal, utility is decreasing as we go up. Now, if the refund threshold is close to the equilibrium value, but not too high, we can show that there's a constrained equilibrium where would it be nice if I had another plot here? So I should have theta times P to show which region the refunds must be in. It's going to be, but if you have a line coming up that's close to the equilibrium value, but not too far up, there's a constrained equilibrium that remains on this curve where consumers are indifferent between inspecting after and before. And so consumer surplus must be going down. But as a more positive result, I want to leave you on a positive note here. Okay. So as a more positive result, if the difference between the production cost and salvage value is not too large, so we're in a world where the social cost for returns isn't too high, so that society would be better served by having returns, then there does exist a refund threshold such that there is a constrained equilibrium that achieves the maximal social welfare. So you can choose some theta so that firms set the price minus the refund equal to that difference between the production cost and the salvage value. So you can achieve the optimum. Right, okay, and this is, right, so I won't go through the intuition of the proof for now because I think I'm low on time. So this is mostly what I had to say. So just to conclude, the rise of e-commerce has brought a surge of returns. And we suggest in this paper that it is important to understand the product returns in a market context in connection to the relative ease with inspecting products post-purchase. So in terms of our methodology, what we do is we extend the seminal Volinsky paper to have firms choose the price and refund while allowing consumers to inspect before, after, or not at all. The market equilibrium is always unique and can be of 3 different categories. All right, and we also characterize the properties of equilibrium with returns and show that firms stimulate returns by offering a refund that is larger than the salvage value. The firm's strategy is independent of the production cost. So the price and refund is independent of the production cost in the equilibrium. And the firms can expropriate almost all surplus when the pre-purchase inspection cost is high and the post-purchase inspection cost is low. Right? Now, if returns are provided by the market, then the return policy is never, or generically, never efficient. All right, thank you.
Thank you for a great presentation. We now open it up for questions. And feel free to just unmute yourself and ask.
All right, go ahead. Thought I saw some hands.
I did as well.
Maybe the answer occurred to them. Okay.
Yeah. I'll start then.
Great.
So the thing that, it's not so much a complaint. It's more of a kind of thinking through the consequences type of question, where I'm trying to think through what's being driven by the fact that essentially there's only learning on that second part versus there's no information provided on that initial search. Versus in, I think, the other paper that you had mentioned, I think there's a component you learn pre-purchase and a component you learn after purchase, and that drives some of the dynamics. My worry is that, or not worry, but question is kind of how does everything change when there is enough noise that the firm doesn't know exactly whether, for example, they're indifferent over a few of their different options. There's kind of an internal diamond type logic going on here, not a diamond paradox, but an indifference that I'm wondering how that affects things.
Right, that indifference is important to the result for sure. Let's see. Well, one thing we could do is we could that doesn't change the model at all is you could have consumers, when they first pay the epsilon search cost, what they learn is whether or not they're going to have a match with this firm. So, right, so you could make it so that they have no match or it's drawn from this distribution. And actually that doesn't change the model at all. All it does is change the epsilon. Then you can just have a new net epsilon when we're doing it. So we can include an initial one, which I think is probably realistic, right? When you're probing through the internet, you see some goods, you're like, okay, that's not at all what I want to look at. When you see the price in the return policy, and then you can just bypass that if it's that negative signal was low enough. And then you can decide, okay, well, am I going to continue with my search? Am I going to probe it further? Or do I just want to go to the checkout and buy it and inspect it at home? So we can accommodate that straight away, which I think that at least intuitively probably makes it feel a little bit more comfortable, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
Okay, cool.
Marcel. I have a question. Hi. Maybe I missed this in the end, but what is your take on the regulation that we have in place right now that you can return for full refund?
Right. So in the EU, right, for online purchases, you can return within 2 weeks.
People in the EU, yeah.
EU, yes. Yeah, so that's for 2 weeks, right? I think it's 2 weeks or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Martin, I think might know better, but there's like still a limit to it. So what that would say is that's generically suboptimal though, right? That would, if I take it literally, let's just say it's a full refund. There's no other limits to it that we would want to capture by having a less than full refund. Actually, for that one, is it known whether the firm has to pay the shipping cost?
I know that they do most of the time.
Right.
Because this is not reinforced. This is a competitive outcome, I think. I think the regulation does not require them to pay for the shipping cost.
You think the regulation does not require them?
Exactly.
Okay, so that's more competitive. And so then in that case, it would be, if there's no damage to the good, then that would be the socially optimal move, right? Because then what you would be setting is the refund, the actual refund minus the shipping cost to the consumer, right? Equal to the difference between the production cost and the salvage value. So under one interpretation where the only loss to the firm is potentially the shipping cost, as long as you make the consumer pay that shipping cost, then the social optimum is achieved, because the consumers then internalize all the social damage that they would have from placing a return. So in that sense, it would, if the consumers are being asked to pay the return, the shipping cost, then it could be socially optimal.
Okay.
Depending on the cost to the consumer.
I was just wondering what effect it has on the search strategy of the consumers and whether this leads to wasteful search, or I guess it reduces wasteful search and is thereby good.
Right. I guess I would have to say it really depends. I'd have to look at the particular market, because in a market where firms would struggle to resell the item, right? It could be hard to improve it or something.
Throw them away for like half the.
Exactly. So in that case, then it's way too generous of a policy, right? Because then you don't have the consumer internalizing the cost.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it would be market specific. Yeah. Right, Dan?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. There's shipping costs both ways. So wouldn't it still be off? Because in Germany and other places, I think I had to pay to send it back, but I was always refunded the shipping cost to me. Or are there some places where you're not refunded either shipping cost?
Right. So with Amazon, for example, if you just look at the return policy, as long as the return has nothing to do with a mistake by Amazon, they'll give you a full refund minus the shipping cost. So they will pass the shipping cost on to you. But actually in the model,
which shipping cost though? The shipping cost to send it to you, or the shipping cost to send it back?
To send it back. I'm just talking about just on the return side.
So then it wouldn't equal though, because Amazon would still have to eat the shipping cost to you. I'm just saying they wouldn't perfectly align. If the only shipping cost you paid is the one to send it back, there was still the loss to the firm for the cost to send it to you. Even if
but I think that would be part of the production cost, right? We'd probably want to put that in the production cost. Just interpret the production cost as being, okay, part of the production cost is if we have to ship it to you, right? And the firm has to incur that cost.
Yeah, but they would re-incur that cost if they had to send it out again, versus
Right.
they wouldn't incur the other part of the production cost. So it would be different. I
Right.
could be missing it.
Sure. One point, maybe this will answer your question, is that in the model, it doesn't matter if you initially make it so that the consumer would have to pay the shipping cost or the firm does. You can just relabel the variables, and those are the exact same model, actually. So it doesn't matter who initially has to, because if the consumer initially had to pay the shipping cost, I, as the firm, can just give you a more generous refund to compensate it.
Oh, I'm more thinking in this real world policy that we're discussing.
Right. Well, I think
I
even
think a
in
little
real
bit.
world, right?
Yeah.
Right. Like it doesn't matter who initially has to pay the shipping cost. If I can control the refund, that's the important point, is that if I can make my refund generous enough, I could just pay you for the shipping, right? So I have control over that as the firm, who ultimately pays for the shipping cost. Like even if you initially have to foot the bill, I can give it to you. And of course, you might say there's interest rates if there's a delay in me compensating you for having to pay shipping. But if I can just give you the full amount, then it's the same.
I'm more thinking about if the legal system forces you to give a full refund on one side, but then you can charge the cost of shipping back. It's like
Then that would be a weak
it's not a
regulation. You're
full
saying,
yeah. It's
okay,
more
absolutely.
very
Yeah.
specific to the example that we're talking about. Though I think it's
Okay.
relevant for policy because generally you see
Exactly.
blanket policies.
Exactly. And so for even in the United States, there are some return policies where they have some mandatory returns, but that only holds if you don't state your return policy. And it doesn't mean that you can't include a restocking fee or a return fee, or it doesn't state who has to pay the shipping. So see, I think that's all very relevant when we're thinking about actual policies and thinking about whether these policies are actually affecting the market. So that's a very relevant question. Yeah. All right.
Can I ask one maybe like more technical question?
Yeah.
So it was a little bit fast. So why did you get this asymmetric region where you get so I guess the firms must be indifferent between offering those two things. Is this to somehow make the consumers indifferent between inspecting before or after by changing the value of search?
Right. So what we're doing is, as we're going up in that region, actually, let me go ahead and return to that in the slides. Right. So as we're increasing, we are in the refund equilibrium. Consumer surplus is not changing. So what we're doing is we're increasing the production cost. Consumer surplus is staying fixed, but the profit for firms is going down because they have to eat this production cost every time they sell the good.
Yeah.
Right. So then at this point, as you correctly inferred, the firm's profit is the same with playing in the refund equilibrium and deviating to what we call the Volinsky contract. So it's the price, the optimal price, inducing consumers to inspect before. And so now, as we increase the production cost, though, you might say, well, why isn't there a Volinsky equilibrium straight away? Why don't all of the firms switch over? But what happens is, as the firms switch over to the Volinsky, so let's say all the firms charge the Volinsky price right here, that would reduce consumer surplus, right? So we have a drop in consumer surplus, but then that would make charging or offering the refund contract more profitable. Okay, so you have this thing where if everybody switches, it makes it relatively more desirable to offer the refund equilibrium. And so there needs to be an incomplete fraction of firms charging the Volinsky price.
Okay.
And that's what's driving. It's the change of the consumer surplus in the background, changing the relative profit. But I don't think it's obvious at all that would make it more desirable to move to the refund equilibrium.
And the social planner also wants to have this asymmetric? I missed that bit.
Well, that's a good question. So the social planner would never want an asymmetric region. So for the social planner, there's always going to be some function f, so that below the function, you would want, well, I should say generically. So below the function, there's going to be returns, above it, no returns. On the curve, they're indifferent.
This is just because they're dictating what the firm should do, so you don't have to have the indifference.
Exactly. So you don't have to worry about the fact that lowering consumer surplus is going to make it more profitable to deviate for firms.
Okay.
Great.
And one silly question, maybe I misunderstood something. When you had that first diagram, you said that if the price is very low, then of course everyone just buys without inspecting. Yeah, this one. So does that make some assumption on the size of the search cost? I mean, even if the good is very cheap, right? I mean, if the search cost is small.
Right. I should have been clear on this. So here what I'm holding fixed is both the outside option for continuing. I'm holding fixed
I
the
see.
search
Right.
cost, and I'm just changing the price in the
Okay.
refund.
Yeah, makes sense.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Of course. Good questions. Anything else?
I'm going to stop the recording now, but questions can continue.